Okay, can you guys hear anything now? Just checking the audio here. Test. Okay, so audio. I think we just had another mic issue. Sorry, guys. Tons of prep work going on here running into Substance Days, which is going to be starting tomorrow. So yeah, it's just been a madhouse around here. So everything's just kind of coming together, kind of crashing down here. So sorry about all this confusion and everything. So here, let me just take a step back of what I was talking about. So yeah, like I said, what we're going to do in this month's webinar is we're going to discuss this procedural wood material. And so, like I've said, I've done a wood material before, and this one is completely new. So the one I had before, I really didn't like. There was a lot of issues that I had. So this one here, what I'm going to do is describe a lot of new techniques in how to produce something like this. Also, going to show you some cool techniques on how to procedurally place all of the nail holes so that as we change the plank amount, the nails will follow along with that. So let's just jump right into this here. And what I'm using now is Substance Designer 2017.1.1, so it's the latest version that had just come out. So before we start getting into each one of these nodes, I just kind of want to do just a general overview of kind of the structure that I've been working towards with the way I'm building these substances. And of course, if you guys have any questions, please just post there in the live chat, and I'll pause from time to time to check to see if I can answer any questions as we go. All right, so you'll notice here that I have my substance, and then I have several of these sub-graphs that are underneath it here. And, more and more I'm starting to break my substances down into separate graphs as much as possible, and that really helps with optimization as well as organization. And also it just helps you to, reuse elements, which is so important when you're creating procedural materials. So in this particular case, the main graph that we're going to be working with is this one here called Wood Planks Aged 02. And so this is going to be the material that outputs our actual textures. So we can see here at the very, very end, we've got our base color, normal, rough, height, ambient occlusion, and so on. So these are going to be our final outputs. These other guys here are what I refer to as utility nodes. So these are just serving a specific purpose. In this case here, you see pattern. This one here is designed to just give me a wood pattern that you see here. And in this particular case, I'm just outputting, this is going to be in just what I call a lines output. And so you can see here, I just left the usage completely blank. I didn't even worry about it. This one here is the actual height. So let's take a look here. So this is like the height texture. It's got a height usage, and then here I've got another pattern, which is the wood pattern. So this is this wood pattern, and you can see again here, just usage is left to blank. So one of the first questions here, can we get a copy of this substance? Absolutely. I'm going to be sharing this on Substance Share, but when Charles does the email recap, I'll make sure that you guys have all the source files, and he'll deliver those through the email. You should get that within a day or so. Okay, so that takes care of our pattern, and then I created some knobs here. So you'll notice what we have. If you look, it's really hard to tell what this is right now, but like I said, it's a utility graph, and what we're going to use this guy here for, and what you're seeing right now in this output is just the mask portion of it. This is going to be like the wood knobs that you'll see in the wood. So again, broke this out into its own substance as well. And then finally, we have this moss, which is basically its own kind of material. So this is what this is turning into here. So this is a moss. And again, I'll kind of run through what these guys are so you can see, some of the processes that I had. All right, so let's jump back here to our main graph. One other thing I want to mention whenever I organize my substances this way, for any of these graphs that are part of this package, that I don't want to be a full material, meaning that if I were to take this into a program like Maya or UE4 or Unity, I don't want the substance plugin to generate another material for me. So in those cases, what I'll do is I'll select the graph, I'll come over here to my attributes, and always set output computation to no. So again, that means when it's published, the Substance plugin, if you're using those, it's not going to try to generate a separate material for you. Now, sometimes you may want that, but in my case, I didn't. All three of these graphs here are just subgraphs. Okay, so here we go. We're back to our main graph here. And so as you'll see, I've tried to organize this as best as I could. Nodes start getting a little bit crazy, as they always tend to do. But what I do, again, following the same procedure that I always talk about in our webinars, is that I start simple and then move to complex. So you'll see here within this graph, we start here towards the end, very simple shapes. We're working grayscale, where the whole purpose here is for me to build up a height texture. And then, as you'll see, I'll start to build complexity as I come up towards this end. Once I get around here, you'll see that we are going to create like a full height texture, which is what we're seeing here in the 2D view. And then once I have that height texture is when I start to extrapolate my other maps, such as my normal map. Here's my ambient occlusion. From the ambient occlusion, I derive my roughness. And then here from my height, I will also start to derive my color. So here's how we get our color. And you'll notice again that I kind of try to derive all these maps from one single source, being the height information. Also here, as we talk about with roughness, you'll see that I start to generate my roughness from my ambient occlusion. And I feel like that's pretty important because in this particular case, the ambient occlusion, you can see the level of detail that I'm getting here. And I'm getting this because I'm actually using the new horizon-based ambient occlusion. I say new, it was I think it was in Designer, one of the last versions of Designer 6 before we moved into 2017. I can't remember which one, but it gives you a really great result with the key being you have a very nice detailed height information that you're feeding into it. And so, like I said, this is giving me kind of my ambient occlusion, but it's also helping me to really describe kind of the surface attributes, the kind of the surface quality, how rough something is, all the little divots and shapes and little nooks and crannies and things like that. And so once you have that information, it's really pretty simple to change that into roughness, as we'll see. So that's kind of the overall structure. Like I said, all of these nodes here, this is all completely grayscale. Let me just make a little room here. So all these guys, this is all grayscale operation, again, building up that height. And then we go through an extraction phase, which is like right here, where we start to extract things like our maps we just mentioned. Then we start to move into color. And then finally here at the end, you can see that I bring everything down into just a full material node. So that's what this guy here is. And from that, I'm working with the base material. I can start to layer other materials in, like my water, my moss, and dirt, and so on. So then at this final stage, we're actually doing material layering here within Substance Designer. Okay, so that's kind of a broad overview, and that's how I always work with all of my substances. So now let's take a look at how we can start to create this. So the first thing that we want to do is start with our plank shapes. So like I said, I start really, really simple. We got like rectangles here. Now, in order to create this, what I did was I used the tile generator. So just the regular, simple tile generator. And you'll notice here that in my pattern image input, I'm actually feeding in some values here. So what am I doing? I'm feeding in, I started here with this grayscale image. This is a gradient linear 1 node. And then I'm processing this grayscale range here with just a histogram range. So this is kind of what I'm getting, a little bit brighter here, and then it moves down to a kind of a darker value. And this is what I'm going to use here in my tile generator, and I'm doing this so that I could produce these slope effects. So you can see that for each one of these planks, you can see some of them, it's kind of gray, dark here, and then it moves to white. Here again, dark moves to white. This one here, it's kind of dark, and then it moves to white kind of in the opposite direction. This here is giving me, since this is my height I'm thinking of, this is giving me this kind of offset balance to what this height range is going to be. So one of the things I like to do to kind of demonstrate this, let me create myself here a base material node. And I'm going to do just a little bit of setup on this guy. So see grayscale, let's take my metallic value down. Let's pull the roughness value up pretty large here. And then just really quick so we can see what we have, let's do a normal map. And let me set this to like kind of a high value here. Now on this base material, let me just enable my normal and my height. So we'll plug this guy into here, and then my height will plug into here. Okay, so I'm only doing this so I can help kind of visualize what's happening here. So now I'm just going to pull this here into my 2D view, and now my 3D view, and we can start to see what we have here, these planks. So let me go back here to my normal, and let me just really overcrank this so we can try to bring out a little bit more intensity to this guy. For my material, so I'm going to come over to my materials, my definition, I am using, I'm going to switch this to tessellation. And then I'm going to come over here and edit this material and adjust my scale. So let's set this up to something like, say, 2. And let me just kind of rotate this guy around and increase my tessellation factor. Okay. So now you can see the effect of what we're getting here with this, with these slopes that we have. So here you can see where the bright area here is kind of pushing this guy up, and then it's kind of sinking down as it goes kind of dark. And I'm getting that effect by, again, feeding this kind of image into my image input. So another way that, or some important settings here for this tile generator, you'll notice here that I have a number X and Y, and I have this guy exposed. And this is driving a lot of parameters, as you'll see later on. So, of course, we'll get into that. And also we have some other important settings here. So one of which being, let's see, if I just scroll down here, you can see that on my inner size here for the X, you can see I put just a small random a small little bit of a value into that. And then I also came in here into my luminance variation and contrast, and you can see that I'm working here with these values. So for example, if we start to just kind of move this guy here, you can see how this is going to start to change. So right now it's trying to compute the entire graph, which is kind of heavy for that. So let me just kind of turn that around. Let's see here. Another thing that I have is this fixed rotation. So if I take this fixed rotation, let me take this guy down to 1 and then take this guy down here. All right, so this is kind of the slope effect that we're getting right now. And you can see that everything is pretty much all moving in the same direction after I feed in this gradient map here. And so one of the most important settings I have is to be able to come in and change this fixed rotation and rotation random here. So when I put these guys back, you can see that I can effectively kind of force this gradient to kind of rotate around into different directions. And that's what's giving me, these different kind of height values, which is really important to selling this effect. And that's pretty much what I have here for this tile generator. It's simple, but like I said, I use this kind of workflow here to introduce a gradient so that I can have these slopes as well. So that's what we have. Now, the next thing that we want to start working on here is to start refining what we have for this shape. So here in this area, I've got my nail holes, and we'll come back to that. But what we want to talk about now is just kind of more of how we're starting to refine these plank shapes here. All right, so what we're going to do now is kind of get into this section. So let me just make myself just a little bit more room here. And let me just kind of compute some of these guys here so we can see what we're doing. All right, so you can see one of the first things that I'm going to do with this guy. Actually, before I move into that, you'll also notice, you can see I've got tons of these connection lines just going out from everywhere. So again, I spent a lot of time kind of explaining this here to start, but you can see that, this node, the way this is set up with this tile generator, this is going to be driving a ton of other nodes throughout the process. So I wanted to make sure that, I'm explaining what this is doing and how much kind of effort I'm putting into making sure that this is giving me the correct kind of value ranges that I want. So with that guy, I'm going to run a histogram scan on it afterwards to produce myself a mask, basically. So white's going to be the planks, and of course black is going to be like kind of the cracked areas. And then I'm going to run a slight bevel on this guy. So I'm just using the bevel node, and you can see it just gives me a nice little edge here. So again, just kind of rounding out those planks, little beveled edge. Then I'll run a warp node on it. So let's take a look at what this is doing. We just do a simple warp with a Perlin noise. And here I've got another warp here. So now we're warping with those kind of those slope values that we have in place. So now that I've kind of got these more broad kind of warping kind of shapes like that I have here. So again, like I said, this is kind of like kind of still high level. I'm not getting down into the small details yet. So that I've got those overall kind of warp. Now what I'm going to do is start moving into trying to break this guy up into even more shapes. So that's when I use my slope blur grayscale. And so for this one, I use this Perlin noise. And you can see here that I set my samples high and my intensity. And this is set to the min mode. And so what we're going to have with the min mode is basically any kind of areas that we have black, you can think of those black values are going to be kind of pushed towards the white areas. Max is going to do the opposite. It's going to take the white values and kind of push those towards the black areas. And then the blur option is going to be a mix between the two. So you can see what I'm trying to do with this shape is like before what we had here is, let me just bring this guy into here. Whoops, sorry, wrong node. There we go. So here we've got just this basic shape, and what I want to do is start to introduce some slopes into this. Almost like, again, like if I'm using a sculpting program and I have like a trim dynamic brush and I'm just kind of like trying to trim out some of these edges to introduce some planes into this. And so I use the slope blur to do that. And so here's, it's an intense value, when I get this, but I'm starting to get some planes that you can see here. So this is really white, it slopes down, here's an angle, an angle, an angle, a lot of different angles onto this guy. So here's one version of that. Now, again, one of the things I always mention is that it's important that, once you start to kind of break these effects up, variation is really key in creating these procedural materials. So you can see I did it one level with the slope blur, and then I go and do it again. This time it's on a little bit of a smaller area. So you can see this one gave me these kind of like smooth slope edges. Now the next slope blur, which is using a different noise, is now crunching into those areas and providing this type of kind of damage detail, like these kind of cracked spots like this. And this area right here is pretty cool for some like old kind of weathered wood panel. And that's what I'm trying to work with. Now, I want to talk to you about this noise here. We've talked about this guy here before on some of our webinar streams. So this is the environment toolkit. This is just a utility node that I made, and this is, you can actually find this on Substance Share, and I use it a lot. Basically, all I did was just found a lot of the types of noises and types of effects that I need to do to create a lot when I'm doing my materials. And so once I found myself saying, you know what, I'm constantly making these cracks, or I'm constantly making this type of noise, I just kind of wrapped all those into a node that I call the environment toolkit. That I can just simply reuse. So it just really saves a lot of time. And just to give you an idea of what this guy does, so you can see that on this node here, it's got a type. If I wanted to do like faceted edges, it produces this type of noise, which I'll show you. We can do that later. Here's cracks. So it produces these types of cracks. If I need rocks, it'll make rock shapes for me, and so on. So it's just like I said, a real helper utility. And that's on Substance Share if you're interested in checking that out. So in this case, I used my warp slopes type, and you can see that I'm increasing my intensity and edge sharpness to generate this type of noise here, which again is something I use a lot. And so now we're slope blurring this to get these extra details. So now you'll see that I go and do it again. So now it's another slope blur. This time I'm using Clouds 2. The Clouds 2 noise is something that I use often when I'm working at kind of like the finer level, meaning that I want to look at producing some real chipped edges, real chipped type effects around the edges. So here, if I take a look, you can see that these types of cracked in edges like we're producing here is what this Cloud 2 noise is really good at doing. So feed Cloud 2 noise in, intensity again set to min. Min is more like a subtractive process. So again, it's like we're it's like a trim brush. We're trimming away at the sculpt that we're doing here right now. So again, you can see the stages process of this. I like to think of it, I say this a lot, sorry if I sound like a broken record, but I think of that in terms of ZBrush. I'm sculpting on this guy. So this is subdivision level 1, subdivision level 2, subdivision level 3, and you can see I'm just adding detail as I go. Okay, let's take a look at my next effect here. So then what I do for this guy, as you can see here, let's go back up to this guy here. So like I said before, what we have right here, let's just look at this slope. It's pretty intense. So in order to kind of fade that back, what I do is I use a blend node. So you can see I'm feeding the blend node. In the background, I have just the plain version without any type of chipping effects. Then I just, with a copy mode, I just drop the opacity just to kind of feather to feather this slope blur back against the original. And so now I'm starting to reintroduce also some of these kind of sharp edges that I had as well. And so here you can see where I'm doing that again with this guy. So here's what we had before. Here's what we had with just the straight edges. Now here's what we have with this guy blending back into it. And so it just, again, it's just a way of feather that back. And again, I'm just using copy with just a slight opacity. Okay, so now before we get into out of this section here, I want to talk to you about this edge curl. This is another effect that I'll do quite often. So let's take a look at how I did this guy. All right, so first thing I did, let's see. I've got my slope effect here. So this is just, again, going all the way back to this guy, my tile generator. I ran this through a levels, and you can see where I took the input black and white and just kind of crushed those values, because what I'm doing is I'm trying to get just like real white kind of on some of these edges, and then it just slopes off pretty quickly. So we get this effect. Then I went in and I produced this edge mat like this. And so in order to create this edge mat, what I do is I'll take like basically this guy here, which is just my black and white mask, one of the first operations we talked about here. I blur it, and then I subtract it back by itself. So here's the blur, here's the original, and it's a subtract, and this gives me a nice kind of inner edge mat here. So you can see that right now this kind of white area is focusing around the outer edge of the planks. And so then I'm going to take basically this guy, this effect, and kind of blend these guys together with a multiply so that I could get just some of these edges like this to make like this curling effect. And now if we zoom in right here in my 3D view, you can start to see where it just kind of has a little bit of a curve here to this slope. And right in here. And so that's what I want to do, just a little bit of warping type effect that's more concentrated on the edges. And then of course I run it through a levels here so that we can really, actually I should have showed you this one first so we could see the actual value range. So here's what this is doing, and you can see here how it's producing this kind of curve. And then that simply blended it back over top of all of the noise we've been creating. So it might be a little hard to see. If we kind of focus in right on this plank here, you can see that it's kind of real kind of bright. The white values are much more intense, and then again it kind of follows that slope range. And so that kind of gives me some of that kind of basic paneling that I wanted here for my wood. Okay, I am going to skip the nail holes right now. Actually, no, I'm sorry. Let's do that right now, because let's do it while it's actually pretty simple. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. Let me just right click on this guy and let me compute my node thumbnails here so we can see what we're doing. So there we go. So like I said, what we want to do here is we've got these planks. And what I want to do is I want to place some nail holes. Like I want to put like one here and here and here and here. And I want to do that. I want to have 4 nails for each board. 2 at the at one end and 2 at the other end, basically. And so I want to be able to place these nail holes procedurally so that in the event that I change the plank amount, like we'll do here, the X amount, I want these holes to follow along with what the planks are doing. And so it's actually not very hard to do this. So here's how I'm going to show you how that works. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to rely here on another tiling node. So I'm going to use the tile sampler here to help me do this. So if we look at this guy, you can see I'm going to use the tile sampler, and so it's starting to create these circles here for me. And all I'm doing with this guy is I've got a specific amount, and its pattern is just set to disk. Other than that, there's nothing really going on here. And this guy's just a tester. So actually I can throw that guy away. So let's do this. Let's look at this guy. So here we go. This gives us our nail holes. So you can see right now we're thinking about this in terms of just a mask. Okay, and like I said, the X and Y amount is going to be driven by an input parameter, which we'll talk about. We're going to have to create a function to handle that. Okay, the question becomes, how do we set this? How do we do this? How do we produce this? Well, the way we do that, here, let me just copy and paste this guy. It's actually a masking trick is what we're going to do. So if we take a look at this guy, and let me come over here. I'm actually just trying to kind of reverse this. There we go. All right, so here's the first effect that I created here with this tile node. You can see that it has an X and a Y amount that, again, like I said, are driven by a parameter. And right now, we just have a grid of circles. So we've got, so many across the X and so many across the Y. And this is what we have. So the trick isn't so much that, okay, I need to generate circles at specific areas. What I'm doing is I'm just generating a whole tiling grid of circles and then masking them at specific areas to match the paneling. Now, there's a little bit of calculation to get the masking stuff to work out, which is what I'll show you in the function. But that's all that's happening. So here you can see that this was the tile generator, and then here's the effect of when it gets masked. So here's how we produce the mask so that it works procedurally. So again, I start with my tile generator. So we have this guy. I'm going to run an edge detect on it just to get the edges. Then I'm going to do 2 directional blurs. The idea is that I want to try to mask out the area for the kind of the bottom piece and the top piece of each plank. So if we look at this one here, we want to mask out an area for this top plank and this area here, the bottom part of this plank. So I'm going to run a directional blur so you can see where the value is starting to kind of give me this area. I run a directional blur this way, and then I run a levels on this one. So again, we had this value, but it's very, very faint. So we want to kind of crunch this down so you can see the black is going to end up representing the mask I need. Then we have our levels here. So my directional blur horizontal. You can see it's completely horizontal, and this guy here is completely vertical. Again, we run levels to get this, and then we come into here in a blend these two guys together with a max lighten, and this is the type of mask that we're getting so far. So you can see that this black area here is starting to give me, or starting to kind of help me pinpoint the area on this plank where I would like to place some nails. So you can see here, well, this black area, this could be a nail zone, and this could be a nail zone, and this one, and that constitutes one plank. So I've gotten that far. So next, what we want to do is go back to our pattern, run an edge detect, run a levels. So now this gives us this type of edging. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add this guy back in. So we're going to take this shape that we had and this background shape, and when I add these two guys together, I now get these little black squares everywhere where I would like to get a nail. Now we want this to be a mask that's going to feed into our tile sampler, so I just need to simply invert this, and I do an invert grayscale, and that's how we get our mask. So then we take this and we drive it into our mask input. So on the tile sampler, like I said, the tile sampler, all it's doing is just, drawing out a grid of circles for me. Then when we mask that grid based on the mask that we created based on the planks, we can isolate just these circles. So on this tile sampler, if you scroll down here underneath the color settings, you'll see, where is this guy here? You have this mask map threshold, and that's talking about this mask map input. So you got to set this guy to 1, and it's basically going to just use this mask 100% to mask out this grid. So that's how we get our nails. And then from here, I just blurred them a little bit because I want to put like a little beveling around that edge, and that becomes my nail holes. To create the nail head itself, I'm going to do another trick to make this hole a little smaller. So one of the things I wanted to do was say, okay, well, I've got a hole, and I want the nail head to fit in the hole, but just be a little bit smaller. So how could So the question is, how do you do that? I mean, it's not like I have a tool where I could just go and transform each one of these guys. So you have to kind of do it through a mask. So one question that came in here, could you program these masks using math functions or something like Python 2? That's a good question. Actually, you could create something like this using Python. So I won't go too far into this, but one of the new products that we're launching here, now we've actually launched it for studios kind of on a beta private basis, but we're getting ready to kind of launch this for everyone here. I think it's this week. I actually worked on some videos that you can watch that are going to go on the webpage that kind of show how to do this. But basically, we have a Python API now for Designer that allows you to use Python code to generate nodes here in Designer. So I could, if I wanted to, write Python code to completely generate this node masking system if I wanted to. So that's one way that you could do that. Another thing, when you're talking about using math functions to do that, we will rely on some functions here to help match up this mask. So right now, what we have works only because I have a set value for the X and Y paneling for my wood. If I change that, this blows up everything. Because remember, what I have here is a grid pattern, and I'm masking the grid pattern. So if I change my paneling, I need to be able to mathematically change the X and Y amount to correspond so that it will line up again. So all the circles will line up. And I'll show you how to do that. It's actually kind of simple. So there is some math involved in this process. So like I said, I want to start working on my nail holes here. So I need to kind of basically shrink all these holes. So to do that, I simply do a blur. And then I come into here and I subtract it back by itself. So we have a blur, we have the original, and we subtract it. And that just gives me a smaller version of that. So I'm just basically punching out kind of the edging. Then I run a levels on it. And then I use the curve editor just to put a little bit of, it might be really, I'm zooming in super close. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see the clarity of it, but it puts a little bit of a lip edge on this nail. And when you're actually rendering this, like I used iRay or in UE4 or whatever, you can actually see the little bump that it puts in the normal. So it's pretty cool. And here's the curve that gives me that little kind of bump edge to that. So that's how I create the nails. Now, like I said, if we change the panel, how do we get it to, if we change the panel X amount, how do we get the nails to match up? So let me show you how that works. So one of the things I did over here in my paneling, you can see that my number for Y, I wasn't ever going to change the Y. I was interested in changing the X. So what I did here was I exposed this number X. So let me go into the function graph with this guy. And you can see here that what I have is this value called plank underscore X. And now I'm doing something weird here. Why am I multiplying this by 2? So let me explain that a little bit. So if we come over here to our input parameters, I have this guy here called plank X. And I'll click this drop down here and you can see that this is an integer and it's using a slider. And I have a default, a min setting of 2 and a max setting of 5. And it starts at 2. So this guy's going to go 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are like 4 steps that I can have for my paneling. Now, the reason why I'm using this integer, okay, so if we set this, if you have this guy, let me go back to this tile generator. So let me just copy and paste this guy into here. And let me just clear this. All right, so let's just say we started over at default and I started this guy at 2. You can see that if I just expose this guy as it is, the value that it gives me is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So you have basically the ability to set the integer to an even number and an odd number. And if you set this to an odd number, like say 3, so let's say we had this guy set to 3, and then I came over to my material and I changed my tiling, this is precisely what you're going to do when you bring this into like say UE4 or something. You're going to want to change your tiling. So if you set this to like a tiling of 2 or 4 or something or anything other than 1, the way these planks match up, they don't match up they kind of break basically. So here, let me see if I can show you what this does. Let me plug it into here. All right, so say we had this guy here at let's see if I can get this to work as is. So let me set this to something like, say, 5. All right, so here we have like these little 5 panels here. And now let's say I go into my material and I start to change my tiling. You can see right here, when I change my tiling, see now you get a panel, like a wood panel and a wood panel like right next to each other. So it's kind of breaking this tile. If I go back to this guy, and this guy was set to a number, like an even number, like say 4, now it's fine. So all of the offset is respected basically for what I have in my tile. So the idea here was that, okay, well, I don't want to use odd numbers. Well, there is a setting here within our instance parameters called step. So this is pretty cool. If you wanted to take step value and you set this to 2, when I run this, when I publish this parameter, the step value would move in, well, steps of 2. So it would only let me choose from the slider value 2, 4, 6, 8. It would basically target all the even numbers. And that would be a real simple way to handle this. However, I found out the hard way that our engine doesn't support this in the plugins. So when you export this to say something like UE4, it doesn't respect this step value. So you still have that option that you can break the substance by setting it to odd numbers. Now, that's something I reported to the team, and we already had a ticket involved to have that fixed. So in the future, that'll work. So I just want to tell you, for right now, you can't use this step value. All right, so long story short with that, that's why I had to come into my graph here, and I had to set this guy to whatever this plank value is times 2. So let's look at what I have here. So if we come back to this guy, you can see that I'm going to start off with some set values. So instantly, we know that default value is 2. My function is going to multiply that by 2. So the first tiling amount for the x is going to be 4. And then if I switch this to 3, it's going to be 2 times 3, so it's 6. If I switch it to 4, it's going to be, 2 times 4 is 8. So now you can see where I'm building up that 2, 4, 6, 8. And notice I go to 5. So 2 times 5 is 10. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Those are going to be the amounts that I wanted to work with. So at a value of 10, just visually looking at it, the planks were so skinny it didn't look right. So that's why I stopped at 10. It doesn't break. I just didn't want to go above that. And so I wanted my X amount value to go from 4 to 10. And that's what's being computed here. So the first guy is going to be 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So that default value, what you're seeing here, is an X amount, a number X in this tile generator of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how we're getting that. All right, so again, what I wanted to do with this instance parameters, I wanted to have one value here that is driving everything. So you can see, again, plank underscore X, meaning like how many X amounts that I have. So that takes care of this guy. Now we need to get into the process of looking at how this relates to our nails. So let's come over here to our tile sampler. So I'll select this guy and get my instance parameters. And you can see for this guy, remember, it's just this grid pattern. This is what we have. I'm going into this guy and setting a function for the X and Y amount. Let's look at the X to start. So I'll go into the function, and here you can see that it's the same thing, just a little different. So now I'm basically taking that plank X. So remember, at first, the default is 2. So I'm saying 2 times 4, and that's going to be 8. So I'm just doubling the grid amount versus the plank amount. So remember, our default plank amount was 4. Let's go back just so we can see it. 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically 4 columns, I guess you could say. And then in order to get that to match up for my grid, I have to double the grid amount. So I get 8. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now that I have that kind of relationship set up, you can see that once I come into this guy, and let's say I change the next one to, let's see, I'm sorry, let me go back and look at what my value was. So say I go into this guy here and I change it to 3. So we can see it's going to be 3 times 4 equals 12. So then it's going to just change that amount again to equal. So that means the next plank amount is going to be 6, and then we're just going to double it to get 12. So that right there is easy to figure out how to set up the X amount for this grid. Now, things are going to get a little tricky when it comes to the Y amount for these nails. So if we come into here, you can look at our Y amount. So it's not overly complex, but it just took what I had to do was just mess around with it a little bit visually to see what works. So here you can see I did the same thing, plank times 4. And this worked perfectly well until I got to 5. So 5 and higher. Anytime there's 5, 6, 7, anytime value higher than 4, I started to get it, it started to mess up my grid. So I found out that what I needed to do was basically just do a quick check here and say, hey, if this plank amount, if it's greater than 4, so meaning that it's a value of 5 or higher, then what I need to do is subtract 4 from this value. So let's say we had 5, so 5 times 4 is equal to 20. But in order for that grid to work out, when it gets above 5, so we're, for the Y to work out, we need to subtract 4, so it needs to actually be a 16 tiling amount on the Y. And so that's how I get that. So I do a little conditional here to check to make sure that this guy is, if it's 4 or less, then we're just going to output plank times 4. And that's why it's going right into here in my else statement. If this is true, so meaning I've got my user value set to 5, then I'm just going to subtract 4 by this value, and then it's going to give me the correct grid amount. And so just by figuring out how to set up this kind of relationship between the tiling on the planks and the tiling on this circle grid for that tile sampler on the X and Y, you're able to kind of drive this nail hole effect procedurally. And like I said, the mask always is going to hold up because you can see basically this mask that we're generating is being done procedurally because, we're basing it off the planks and then we're blurring it using these levels and then blending it down to end up getting this. So that's always going to be fine. The trick is determining how many X and Y amount we need so that they fit perfectly within these. So one circle fits perfectly within this mask grid. So a question we have here, which is the way to throw color behind this section to keep organized. Yeah, actually, you can do that here. I think what you're referring to here is like these frames. So you can do that. I do that sometimes, and then a lot of times I just get... Well, you can see I did it here with my edge curl. So here, like say I've got this guy up here, edge curl, you can just change the color. So the frame color is here. You can set this, and then you can also do a description here. So like say if I put generates a mask, you can see that now I've got a little note in here. So you've got your title, which is going to be the title of your frame, and then you can put like any description type stuff you want into here, and it's going to show up right into this area here. So maybe it's I don't think this is probably as flexible as how the Nuke nodes work, but you do have a little bit of extra options there. A lot of times I get lazy with it and I don't do that, but definitely you should do that on a team. Okay, so that takes care of all of this section here of our graph, and now we basically have our nail holes and everything working here. So the next part of this came to working with our actual pattern itself. So we're wanting to generate kind of like this wood pattern here. And here, just checking the stream here just to make sure everything's going all right. Okay, good. All right, so here's where we come in with our wood pattern. And so what I do is I just have a node here, that's just gives me this pattern. So I want to show you real quick how I created that. So let's come here into this pattern graph. And this guy's exploding all over the place. Almost looks like kind of fur, which is kind of cool. Just because if I come into my material, it's just that scale was up. And it's super high frequency height. So that's what's going on there. So here, let me show you how to do this. So what I did was I just started with the anisotropic noise. I blurred it. And then I warped it by a Perlin noise zoom to get kind of this pattern. You can see it's really simple just to kind of make some of this kind of swirly kind of wood patterns by doing that. So I start with that. Then we actually have a wood fibers grunge map. So I grabbed this guy, ran a levels on it, and then blended it back with that wood noise I had multiply. So just these nodes here, it's a really simple way to generate a wood pattern like this. So that works out pretty easy to do that. So then, like I said, I ran a levels on this just to bring up my values again. And then I wanted to start working on my some lines here. So here's how I did the lines. I start here with this grunge map that ships with designers. This is grunge map 005. Do a high pass grayscale on it just to get something like this. And then I run a levels on it to bring up the mask. So the idea is I'm trying to just get like black lines and see how you get these little bitty cracked lines in here. But you kind of get some nice shapes. Like that, you can see like this looks like a little piece here. This little area here, this is like a little, like could almost be like a little piece of wood or something. So I had this guy, ran another levels on it to really just crunch these values here. Okay, so once I had that, then I did a transform, and you can see this transform, I just pushed, scaled it, you know, like a lot here, so that I could just really stretch these these lines to be more like this. So here's what we had before. They're a little too wavy, stretched them to get something more like this. Okay, so this is going to give me the pattern that I have here, all my vertical lines. Now I want to introduce some like cross hatching to this. So in order to do that, I started with this guy here. This is grunge map 11, and so this is, you know, giving me some of these little kind of like chip lines like this. So then I did a transform on it, just rotated and scaled it so it looked like this. Did another transform on it, so basically it's horizontal and kind of scaled it. Did another transform on it just to scale it again, and then I started blending these guys together. So you can see I'm just using multiply and then multiply. So the idea is now I'm starting to get some of these cross hatches, like here. So here's again another kind of view of this little cross hatch. Then I come into here and just multiply this down. So now I've got my lines with some of these cross hatches in it. Then I ran a bevel on it. So the bevel gives me this. And now I'm starting to get kind of like these wood shapes. Again, I'm still thinking height. I'm still thinking kind of mask with that. So now that I have that, I then multiply that down with my original wood pattern. So here's where we're getting so far. Now when we look at this guy, we're starting to get some pretty cool kind of wood, you know, kind of a wood look here with these with these lines and everything. And so that's it. I just have this guy and output this here to my height. Actually here you can see I've got this. Another added effect that I kind of do sometimes is I'll run this emboss. So now when I run the emboss, I really get some nice weight to this wood. Really like some of these shapes and slopes that this provides for me just by using the emboss. So what I do is my input and my intensity is just the same map, and then here's what I get. So that's where things really kind of snap and come together right here. And to me, this looks pretty cool piece of wood at this stage. So that comes out as my height. Then since this is going to be like a utility graph, I want to always make sure that I give myself enough outputs so that I can, you know, use this again with compositing and stuff. So we've got the overall height, then I have an output that just gives me my lines, and then I have another output that just gives me the wood pattern. So basically I have everything combined as a height and then separate my elements out. So it's like render passes basically. Okay, so here's a question. Is there a way to keep the transformation value saved in the node? Because after playing it, it's always, and that's a pain. There isn't a way to set that up right now. Actually, let me try to think about it though. No, there's not. Okay, so in case anybody else is wondering about that question, if I come in and I set some values and then I hit apply, then everything just goes to 100. So you can see that I did some pretty crazy transformations here, but everything is still set to 100. So it's like it's doing a freeze transform in Maya. After, like you do a transform and then you run freeze transform and all your channel boxes all set to 0 or 100% on the X, Y, and Z. That's basically what this node does, and we don't have a way to stop it from doing that at this time. So that becomes my pattern. So let's jump back over to this guy, and let's see how I'm introducing that wood line and pattern. So here I have my wood line, and again, like I said, I got my output for my height and my lines and my wood pattern. So the first thing that I do is I'm going to use my lines here, and I want to be able to have these lines applied to, and my intensity map is going to be my panels again. However, if I just were to multiply my lines over top of the panel, it looks terrible. So let me show you what it looks just like a copy and paste. So here's a trick in case you haven't seen this before. In this, what I want to do right now is I want to borrow this output. So instead of trying to find this node and connect it, if I hold down the control key and left click, I can just grab another section of that off and I'll plug it into here. See, it's still stuck to my mouse. So you just left click off on an empty area, and then I'll grab the intensity and plug this guy in. Then left click off into an empty area to get rid of it. So if I just multiply this guy, here's what we get. We get our lines, and they're over top of our panel, but it looks just like an exact copy and paste operation. So you can see here we've got like this line. It's just following from one wood panel to the other, perfectly matched. And that's never going to be the case in reality because these are pieces of separate wood. Maybe they're even rotated in different ways. So this is really unrealistic. So a trick to always offset patterns is you want to use a directional warp. So what I do is I take a directional warp. Here's the lines, just the input, and then the intensity is going to be, it needs to be some type of grayscale value. So here I've got my planks, and they already have the slope value, and you can see the slope. It's more moving in a horizontal direction. So white to black, black to white. It's all offset too. It's random, but it's basically horizontally. I don't have any vertical slopes here, just all horizontal slopes. So directional warp, you can see that's why I have the warp angle set to the 0, and then I set kind of a high intensity value. And so when I do that, you can see that it's basically just offsetting here. If I adjust this here, let me copy this and paste it off. And I'm doing that because I don't want it to have to recompute a bunch of nodes, so it'll be faster. So as I start to increase this, you can see what it's doing. So at 0 intensity, this line lines up perfectly, and as I increase it, I can get this offset. So if I increase it enough, I break that crack. And that's exactly what I want to do. So now that that's broken, if I look at how that would blend now, you can see that now I get this effect where these lines are not lining up. They're completely different. Like this one's bigger, this one's smaller, and so on. And everywhere that it's white, it's going to be more intense in that than the darker areas. So using directional warps like this is a really good way to randomly break up patterns like you're doing. And so you'll see I do that a ton. Here's another warp where I did the same thing here with this guy. Actually, no, that's not what I'm doing. What am I doing? Oh, sorry about this. Okay, so this here I've got a warp. And I also have my knobs here. So remember I told you before we have these little wood knots. So here's how you create the wood knots. So here I have my knots node graph. And like I showed you before, I call it knobs. I should have said knots, I guess. This guy, you can't really tell what it's doing. It's just randomly producing some circles like that. And what I'm doing here is I'm using basically a circle shape transformed, and I splat it around to get this, and I run a levels on it to have my mask. Then I'm using a dynamic gradient with a linear 1 gradient tiled here to produce this type of effect. So this gives me kind of like that circle wood age type look that we have here. All right, so one question that came in here I just missed. What was that directional warp input? I'll go back to that as soon as I jump over into that graph again. And so then again, I have some noises, just to give kind of these cracked edges, and then I'm multiplying that down here into whatever the shape's going to be. But I gave myself here an input, which I call my wood pattern, so that I could reuse this knobs, or knots, I guess I should call it, in another graph, which is precisely what I'm doing here. So if we come over to this guy now, and I look at my knobs, and I feed into it my wood pattern, this is what I'm generating for me. So I've got that circle with that kind of noise crunched into it. So this gives me those knot kind of wood effects. And then I've got a levels here just to give me a mask. I'm warping it. So notice again, I'm doing the same thing. So this could answer that question you had here on that directional warp. For the directional warp, the input's going to be what you want to warp. Like in my case, it's this mask. And the intensity input is going to be what you want to warp it by. Basically, it has to be a grayscale value or it's not going to work. Like if it was just complete black and white value, it wouldn't do anything. or it would, but it would just be like this really harsh edge. It wouldn't give you the effect that you need. You need to have some type of slope into that. So now you can see I'm taking these knots and breaking them off based on my panels. So that's what that looks like. Then I'm doing the same thing here with this warp here. So here's this guy. I've got my lines, and now I want to, I'm sorry, that was the wrong guy. It was this guy we were talking about. So now here I've got my wood panel, and I want to add those knots that I'm creating. So what I do is I just use a regular warp node, and my gradient input is going to be this. And when you run it, you can see this starts to warp these lines like this. So that's giving me the start of warping of my wood. I do the same thing up here with my lines, except here I've got my line, and my gradient input's going to be my knot mask that's been warped by the panels. And so now you can see my line, when it gets around the knot, it warps around it like this. So here's that kind of line from the wood and warps around it, and so on. So that's how we're generating these guys. So again, what I do here is I use that same mask, multiply it, or I'm sorry, subtract it in, because I want that hole just to be kind of like a little dark edge. And see how I've got that little dark gray value? That gives it a nice little kind of like a bevel inwards, basically, when we integrate this into our height. All right, so we have, this is where we're starting to integrate in our knots. Here we have our nails. Now I did the same thing here with my nail mask. I took my nails, and now I'm running a directional warp. I'm taking these lines here, and you can see on this time I'm doing it vertically, and I'm breaking that nail hole based on the lines. So what this does is it's going to, the nail hole is going to look a little bit, you're going to see a little bit of edging into this guy from the actual lines that are hitting it in the wood. And so now when we integrate this guy in, this is the nail hole, and I just subtracted it in. So this white value, this is the panel, subtract in the nail hole. Okay, so then I wanted to add in a little bit more extra effect to this guy. So you can see what I did for him is I used my environment toolkit set to facet edge. Now the environment toolkit has this directional warp system built into it, because again, like I said, it's something I do a lot. And so in my case, what I did was I said I want to use these facet edges, but I want to enable my pattern randomize and warp. So I enabled it, set the intensity value, and for the input, again, I'm just feeding in my paneling. And so now it warps it based on that paneling. And so now I'm using this, just multiplying and then dropping the opacity in to get some more kind of just detail into those panels for that wood. So as you'll see, a lot of this, again, it's procedural. It's just like effect upon effect upon effect. You know, we're just layering this guy little by little. That's how we get into that. So now we're going to take our lines here after we've warped everything in with our knots, and then I'm just going to multiply those in, and I drop the opacity down. So now we're getting to this stage. Here, I've taken my wood noise and then I did the same thing, took my paneling, directional warped it just to offset everything, and then I integrate that into with a multiply and lower the opacity. So now I'm getting my wood pattern back. Now here, I'm taking my nails, the ones that we talked about earlier, just the nails, and I'm integrating those guys in here with a max lighten. So here you can see that you get the nail head, and then the hole is just kind of like, you know, a little bit kind of black around it like this. So you can see you get, you know, kind of just different edging around that. Then I use my cracks. So again, I'm using my environment toolkit with my pattern randomization. I've got this guy set to crack mode, and I'm feeding in my paneling. So here's my cracks, and then we just simply integrate that in. This gives me my cross hatching. So we got our lines going vertical, and now these cracks are going horizontal. So it gives me some of this cross hatching here. This guy here, let's see what he's doing. This is where now for the knot, what I'm doing here is I'm taking those knots that I had, and I'm just integrating. So right now, see how it's just blurred? Now I've got the knot detail itself, that wood. and I'm bringing those in based on this opacity mask, and then I use the opacity slider as a little bit of a feather to that. So now, if we look at these knots, this is, see how it's warping around this knot area, and here's the detail that we get. So that's how we get that piece in the wood. And then here is kind of the final integration of everything for that height. And then, like I said, from there, we generate out our normal map, and then we generate out our height, our ambient occlusion, again, using that horizon-based ambient occlusion here to get that to work. So here you can see where everything's kind of coming together now. And that ambient occlusion really kicks out these details. See, look at how the knot's working in here and stuff. I was pretty happy with how some of this is turning out. Okay, so now I want to talk to you again just about the more of the map extraction process. So like I said, we did our normal, we got our ambient occlusion. I like to always work with the maps that handle surface attribute stuff, like, you know, the actual surface itself, not the color. We do color last. So that's why I break out my roughness. Roughness I thought was pretty easy. The way I do it is I take my ambient occlusion, I just invert it, and then I do a histogram range node and just set the range to 1 and then hit my position. And this allows me to just have a control now for my position on how much I want to adjust my roughness. So I could expose this as a roughness control. So for example, if I drop this guy down here pretty low, now my wood looks, you know, real glossy, like maybe it's got, you know, some kind of varnish on it or something. And so on. So I forget what value I had with that. Yeah, we'll do that. Actually, maybe it's a little cooler if I drop the value down. So anyways, like I said, I should have exposed this value, and then I got a nice little roughness control. So I always use that histogram range right before I pipe that into my roughness. And so like I said, as I've been working with this, and I've talked about this in several of our seminars, I always start here with my base material. And as I get a map finished, I come over to that base material node and come down here to my user-defined maps, and then, like, say, for instance, my roughness, and then I would plug it in. And then I'm just right-click, drag and dropping this here in my 3D view as I, I'm not viewing my outputs, I'm just viewing this base material. Because the idea is I want to take all of these this channel information and pipe it down into one base material node. And when I do that, I get one node that I can then layer other stuff onto it. It makes it so much easier than trying to connect a whole bunch of different types of nodes. Okay, so way over here, we've handled our roughness, our ambient occlusion. We're good on everything pretty much. Now, what I want to talk about is, here's one thing I like to show, the height. So if you look at my normal map, it's quite noisy. A lot of detail in there. It's probably a little too noisy, I guess. I don't know, but it's quite noisy. The height I want to use as either displacement or parallax occlusion, and you don't want to have a lot of high frequency detail in your height map because it'll just wreak havoc if you try to do any displacement. So the idea is the height, you want it to be kind of cover the silhouette of the shapes, like the overall large shapes, the panels, some of the large sloping shapes. So you can see that I pulled this guy off one of my very early shape type nodes that I was working on. So a lot of detail missing for that. Then I do a blur on it so that, the edges, you can see that it gets some nice kind of rounding edges and all this stuff. Now this becomes the height map that I use for my displacement, if I'm using that, or tessellation, or like I said, parallax occlusion. Notice my nails aren't there, none of that kind of stuff. The holes, none of those more frequency stuff. That's all handled in the normal map. So that takes care of my height. So now I want to show you my color. I actually had a lot of fun with color on this one. So what I do on this guy is, let's see, what do I do? All right, so this, let's go back. All right. Okay, so here's what I did. Now, the image that I have right here looks cool, I thought. When I look at this, I go, man, that's a lot, there's some great detail in there. That looks really nice for wood. Oh, I'm going to use this as my height map. But like I said, it's too noisy, to do this. It's too noisy. It's going to generate a really high-frequency chattering height and normal map. So I didn't want this. But when it comes to the colorization phase, I want to add as many intricate offset kind of grayscale values that I can. Because like I said, I use the gradient node with a pick gradient option, and the more detailed that grayscale map that you're plugging into that gradient map, the more detailed it is, the way more subtle colors you're going to get. So what I do with this is I took one of my base maps that I had already been working on that helped me derive my original height, and I took that guy, some cracks from here, and took this guy, and this time I multiplied it, and then I took the opacity and had it closer to 1, so it's a bit intense looking here in terms of contrast value. Then I took that guy, and then I took my wood map, and then I multiplied those guys together to get even more of kind of a dark kind of wood value like this. Okay, so now we've got that I'm going to use as my basis for a couple things here. So this becomes all my detail. Then what I do is I just pipe that here. Let's move this guy down here. So here is that grayscale map that has all that intricate detail that I want to feed into my color map node. So here you can see I feed it into my color map node. And what I do is I just use my gradient editor like this. So here's my gradient editor. And there's a pick gradient option. So I do pick gradient. And then I actually just go out on the web and I find like a wood image. And I just left click, drag. And it just automatically creates all the keys for me. So it's a real simple way to get that to work. So if you want to see, in case you haven't seen that before, if you're new to that, let me just show you how it works. It's pretty interesting. So let's do this. Let me grab a... Let me just bring a browser window over onto this monitor real quick. Okay, and so here I'll do like wood aged images. So yeah, let's just say we like this guy here. So what we could do is when you come back, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to this gradient map, and I'll use my gradient editor here. Don't have a lot of room here on my maps here. So what I'm going to do is go to my gradient editor, pick gradient. Now it's off on the other screen, but what I'm going to do is just see how I've got this pick slider. If I just left click and drag, you can see this line that it creates. And if I let go, it generates all these keys for me like this. So what I can do is if I just do pick gradient and then just drag this here in my image, it generates my texture for me, my color. And you can get really super intricate levels of detail in your color map by doing this. And then if you got so many keys in here you don't want to work with, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just decrease the precision value. Now that time it's too much for me to even reduce. But sometimes what I may try to do, here let's do it like this and do a pick gradient again, and I'll do just a small amount. So now I've got a small amount of keys that I can actually, adjust on my own too if I want to do that. So this is the result that I'm getting now for this wood. Completely different wood pattern for the color. So just get rid of that guy. So what I did here was I just made a couple different color nodes, and that's the trick that I did. You can see here's the gradient, and here's another variation of that. Here's another variation, just sampling different wood images. Here's another variation, and so on. And this one you can see I went pretty nuts on the key sampling. There's a lot. So yeah, get these guys. And then I thought, okay, it'd be cool if I set this up so that I could use this to have like a color selector. So I used the multi-switch node, fed in the inputs of 4, so my 4 different color options, and then I exposed the input selection. If I go out to my input parameters, you can see here's just that exposed value. So now if I come over to this guy and I switch this to say like maybe a value of 2, it updates and now I get a different wood pattern. If I go to value 3, it's going to move to this guy here, and now I get a different wood coloring value here. Oops, something went weird on that guy. Oops, sorry, I messed it up. 3. So there we go. Now I get just a different wood color. So we'll just go back kind of that default brown here. So that's what's happening there. Now, again, like I said, we want to vary this up as much as we can. So what I'm going to do in this case is then take a hue saturation guy into here. Oh, I'll explain that here in a bit. That's not what that's doing. Let's see. Let's ignore this guy for a second. We'll come back to that. So yeah, here we have our wood. Then I've got just a lighter value, just handpick this guy. And then I've got this my foreground, this is my background, and then I'm doing a copy over this, and now you can see I'm putting a little bit of wear on the edges based on this mask. So in order to create this mask, what I did was I just went back and grabbed that original kind of edge warp, multiplied in some of my noise here, my lines, so just to break it up, ran the levels on it, and then that's where I'm getting kind of this edge, this white edge value. So you can see what it's doing on the wood. So just vary that up a little bit. And then that gets fed there into my color. Okay, and so I'm going to come back to this guy in just a bit when I talk about the water. That's related to the water. Okay, guys, so yeah, I'm trying to head this up. This one's taking a bit longer. I know that it's very late or very early for some people, so I greatly want to try to keep this as on task as possible for you. Okay, so at this stage, this is what we get here. This is our material here. Notice that I don't have my nails material in yet. So now everything's been piped down to this one node. This is great to work this way because now I'm able to go into the material layering process, which makes it a lot easier. So then what I did was I just made a base material node that, a base material node. This is the metal for my nail. So you can see it's just got a metallic value, it's got a color, just real simple. And that's using a material color blend based on my nail mask. So here's my nail mask, add this in, and now I've got the metal for the nails. So the next thing I wanted to do was add some dirt. So I'll use a material color blend, and I use the dirt generator. The dirt generator is a really good generator. Number one, it doesn't have any embedded bitmaps in it, so it's not going to make your substance file larger. And it just is a really good way just to add a mask in kind of these occluded areas. So you can see that you have to generate a curvature and an AO. I already had my AO, and I was able to generate my curvature based on my normal map. So you can see I took my normal, used my curvature node, and just fed that into the dirt generator here. And then it gives me this mask. That's all it's doing. It's a mask generator. Then I use a material color blend. This allows me to create a material based on just constant values that you set here. So this is going to be like a dirt. So I have a dark value, then high roughness value, no metallic, and so on. And so now if I put this guy in, this is what it looks like. It's very subtle at this case. But then what I do is I go into that dirt and I expose dirt level, dirt contrast, and so on, so that I could tweak that later. So that's another layer. That's moss and dirt. Here I've got my moss. That's what this guy looks like. Just to show you how that guy's made. It's pretty simple. Just a bunch of noises. So you can see I've got like stock noises, grunge, wood fiber, transform, just to kind of offset it, blend them together. Use the grunge map 004. Blend in those guys. Again, it's just layering this up. Max lighten. Don't need him in here. Then what I did was I directionally warped this. You can see I've got the warp angle is downwards and a pretty high intensity value. And I'm using this kind of streaked grunge map to produce this. And so what I could do, once I have this map, I just did my gradient. You can see a couple keys that I put in here to get this value. Made a normal map, height map. Again, like I told you, it's just blurred. And ambient occlusion, and so on. Just output all these guys here to my outputs. So then I brought this guy in and just layered him into this. So here's our moss into the material blend based on a mask. Now, here's what I'm doing with this mask. Let me, I think this is a really cool way to work now. So this was a new node that we introduced as well. This is the height blend. So here I'm going to take the height map from what I had for my moss. So here I'm going to put that into the top weight. And then here I took the height from my planks and I brought this guy into here. So if I double click this guy, now the output, we have two outputs here, a blended weight and a height mask. I want to look at the height mask. Now what I can do is adjust the height offset So if you look at this guy, you can see this is really cool. This is like the moss coming up from the cracks in the wood plank. Again, all driven based on those slopes and everything I have from those plank angles to create the moss. I also have this nice contrast control. So you can see here I could increase it to get really sharp edges, or I can just soften the edges like this to kind of bleed in more moss. Really, really great way to blend in these types of materials based on height information. So now I pretty much exclusively use this height blend to do this. Then as you can see here, I expose the height, offset, and contrast as controls for my moss. And then those are simply blended in with a material blend node based on whatever mask I have. Finally, I do the water. So the water's done the exact same way. I use a base material. You can see it's it's basically black here for the color. Low roughness value, a little bit of grunge in it, so on. Just a real simple node. That guy's being blended here based on a grayscale match, which again is my height blend. And there was one instance here. Okay, so here's one thing I want to talk about with this guy. So one of the things, if I do this here, let me go into my actual water amount here, and you'll notice here. Let's do this. I think we're looking at the water. Yeah. All right. So let me view my height mask in my 2D view as I change this value. So we're gonna go to our water amount. I'm gonna start to increase it. So now you can see the water showing up. So here's the height mask. Look at how the water's showing up based on, again, the height of those planks, which is just awesome how this blends into here. Now, it's pretty hard edge, so what I want to do is come over to my water contrast and just lower that contrast setting. And by doing that, you can see that, it also makes the wood look a little wet here as well. Now, here's another trick that I do when it comes to adding puddle and water effects. So when you see this, when you have like the wood color underneath the water, the water is going to have this effect of like increasing, appearing to increase the saturation of the color of that wood. So what I do is I add this hue saturation guy into here. I think, yeah. So what I do is I add this hue saturation into here. And so here's the regular color. Here's the hue saturation, so it's a little brighter. Hopefully you can see that in the video. It's pretty subtle. And when I run this guy, so here's what I had before. Now everywhere where there's going to be water, it's going to start to increase the saturation right where that water is, like this here. So what we're going to get with that is they then just plug this into, in my material blend, I replace that base color that I had originally with this new value here. So again, it's all driven based on the mask input of that. And so that's how I integrate my water into here. Okay, so getting ready to start to close this guy out. My last thing is I output everything here to my final outputs. Now, one of the other things that I did with this guy, if we look, and this is part of Designer 2017, is we have the ability to start to create these presets. So what I can do now, if I go into this preview mode, so I'm gonna hit this little page icon button here, you can see that each one of these controls that I created, like for my moss, my water, and so on, I can click this pin to this. So if I click and pin a parameter, this means that when I make an adjustment, and then if I come over to this button here, so you got this drop down menu, so you can see I created a bunch of presets. I can then click this button here, and that will save the parameter value for any parameter that's been pinned as a preset. Then if I click the gear, the manage preset button, I can come in and I can change the name of the label of what that is that's being created. So for example, now if I come back and set this to default, it's going to set really quickly a default value here. If I set this to be, let me do water moss, it's going to set all my parameters to be to have water and moss without me having to make a bunch of changes. And so these presets are now embedded into the substance when we publish it. So we are working on some of the plugins we're working on. Well, all of them will have this capability, but we're working on them being able to read these embedded preset files. A lot of the substance, I don't know if it's a lot actually, but a I'll say several of the substances that you might find in Substance Source have embedded presets like this. So all of our integrations are going to be supporting presets now. And so that's why we added the ability in Designer 2017 to be able to create the presets yourself using a UI to do it. And so it's really cool. I can come in and just, switch this up. So here's Dirt 04, just a total different preset without me having to make a bunch of, values or, tweak a bunch of stuff. I can just set my preset like this. So that is going to basically finish out everything that I kind of wanted to show you guys on creating this wood paneling system like this. So one thing I want to ask here as well, if anybody has any questions that they want to ask, please feel free to put those here in the live chat. I've got time if you guys want to do a little Q&A. That's great as well. If not, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Charles via email and ask us any questions. Or if you have any suggestions on any type of materials that you'd like to see created in future webinars, let us know and we'd be happy to accommodate for that. So if you don't have any questions, that's great. You can always follow up with me later on. Like I said, Charles is going to supply this source file in the recap email that he sends out. Okay, so if there's no other questions, then we'll close everything out. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we will see you next time.